Hating Skyler White more than Gus, Tuco, or Walter White himself is not an opinion. It is a red flag. Think about that for a second. In a show filled with murderers, meth cooks, cartel psychos, and a man who literally poisons a child, the character that set so many people off was the pregnant wife who asked where the money came from. So here's the uncomfortable question. What exactly did Skyler do that was so unforgivable? Was it demanding answers when her husband vanished for days? Refusing to clap while he built a drug empire behind her back? Sleeping with someone after she had already told Walt the marriage was over? Or is the real problem that she dared to get in the way of a male power fantasy people were a little too eager to identify with? Because this is not just about one TV character. It is about what that hatred reveals, about ego, about gender, and about why a woman saying no triggers more outrage than a man leaving a trail of bodies in the desert. So, be honest. What did you really hate about Skyler White? For a supposedly grounded television audience, it is remarkable how many people managed to watch a middle-aged chemistry teacher become a mass-murdering meth kingpin and decide that the real problem in the story was his pregnant wife who asked too many questions. The Skyler White discourse has been running for more than a decade now, and it refuses to die for one simple reason. It is not really about Skyler at all. It is about what viewers want from Walter White, what they expect from women around him, and how eagerly they will contort basic morality to protect their favorite avatar of frustrated male ego. On first viewing, many people openly admitted they couldn't stand Skyler. The crime was straightforward. She got in the way. The man of the house wanted to build an empire, and Skyler had the nerve to complain about disappearing acts, lies, money that magically appears out of nowhere, and a husband behaving like a stranger. For a large portion of the fandom, that was enough to brand her a nagging shrew. Years later, after several rewatches and a little life experience, those same people now quietly report an embarrassing revelation. Skyler is not actually the villain. She is, inconveniently, the one behaving most like a sane human being dropped into a nightmare. The growth, apparently, is not in Skyler. It is in the viewers, who finally realize that opposing a drug-dealing husband is not a character flaw. The series itself stacks the deck. Vince Gilligan has acknowledged that Skyler was written as a moral antagonist, someone whose job was to stand in opposition to Walter, to challenge his decisions, to be the one who says no, while the plot and the camera lean indulgently toward the man who always says yes. Audiences were not supposed to enjoy her presence. The narrative sympathy sits firmly with Walt for a very long time. He is framed as the put-upon genius, the underpaid teacher, the emasculated suburban husband whose cancer becomes the grand excuse to finally assert himself. In that framing, Skyler is introduced as one more oppressive force holding him down. The penny-pinching wife who scrutinizes credit card charges. The devotee of herbal supplements asking whether he remembered his echinacea. The woman who can barely stop bidding on a meaningless trinket long enough to deliver the most perfunctory birthday sexual favor in television history. Viewers are not subtle creatures. First impressions land, and in the opening hour, the show makes sure Skyler lands with a thud. From there, the audience's psychology does the rest. Once a character has been filed under annoying, every subsequent action is filtered through that label. When Skyler gives Walt the cold shoulder after his bizarre disappearance and the suspicious fugue state story, her behavior is read as petulant and passive-aggressive rather than rational. On paper, she is a pregnant woman whose husband vanished, reappeared with a laughable explanation, and clearly continues to lie about where he goes and what he does. She repeatedly attempts to confront him. He repeatedly feeds her transparent nonsense. Eventually, she stops talking and starts withdrawing. Many viewers, especially younger ones, saw only the silent treatment and declared her unbearable. Only later, revisiting the series with more distance, do they notice that what looked like nagging was simply a person refusing to let obvious deceit pass unchallenged. There is also the small detail that Skyler is heavily pregnant for much of this early turmoil. Some observers have kindly written off her mood swings as hormones, as though heightened emotion in the face of financial ruin, marital betrayal, and looming widowhood requires a biochemical excuse. Even without pregnancy, a spouse whose partner disappears, lies, and effectively announces a desire to die without treatment would be entitled to a meltdown or two. The pregnancy simply magnifies it. Expecting serenity and endless patience under those conditions is less a standard of maturity and more a fantasy that certain viewers apparently hold about how wives should behave while their lives are quietly detonated. Skyler's supposed great unforgivable sin, of course, is Ted Beneke. The mythology goes like this. She cheated on a good man out of spite. The reality is less tidy. By the time she sleeps with Ted, she is separated from Walt and told him clearly that the marriage is over. She is living with a husband who has lied about cancer, money, employment, and his every movement, who has unilaterally decided to break the law in a way that endangers the entire family, who refuses to come clean even when caught. She chooses to hurt him in possibly the only way left available that might drive him out of the house. It is not noble. It is also not some inexplicable betrayal on the same scale as turning oneself into a violent criminal. Yet the discourse repeatedly returns to her cheating, as if it were the master crime of the series. A man can poison children and orchestrate mass executions and still be adored. But a woman who has sex with the wrong person after being pushed past her limits is evidently beyond redemption. The Ted storyline is also where Skyler's own ego and moral compromise come into focus, and this is where more serious criticism of her actually belongs. She does not simply have an affair. She helps cook Ted's books at work, participates in tax fraud, and later deploys Saul's thugs to force him to accept the gambling winnings she has earmarked for the IRS. That escalation leads directly to Ted's catastrophic accident and partial paralysis. The scene in the hospital, where Ted vows never to speak of what happened, and Skyler responds with a curt, "good," is one of the character's coldest moments. It is also one of her most honest. Like Walt, she discovers that once a line is crossed, it becomes alarmingly easy to cross the next one. Pride, revenge, self-protection, all the petty motivations that drive Walt into the desert lab are quietly present in Skyler's choices too. The show is explicit about this parallel. Both spouses break bad when faced with medical bills and wounded pride. Walt refuses the lifeline from Gretchen and Elliot, preferring criminal empire to charity. Skyler refuses to let Hank's pride be bruised by accepting help, and instead engineers a crime to cover his medical expenses. The difference is not that one is corrupt and the other is pure. It is that one becomes a legendary anti-hero and the other becomes the designated scapegoat. Her campaign to force Bogdan to sell the car wash is another example. Up to that point, Bogdan's great sin is being unpleasant and making Walt wash cars. Skyler decides that this petty offense justifies tricking him into believing the property is contaminated so she can acquire it for laundering. The move is undeniably cruel and vindictive. It is also, inconveniently for the Skyler does nothing wrong camp, entirely her own idea. Walt is ready to buy a different business. Skyler is the one who insists on humiliating the man who insulted her husband. The intent is crystal clear. This is about pride as much as practicality, about punishing someone for daring to say no. When fans complain that Skyler is controlling or condescending, they are not inventing those traits out of thin air. They are responding to behavior that the writers deliberately coded as ruthless. The issue is not whether she has sharp edges. It is why those edges provoke more vitriol than the body count racked up by almost everyone else on the call sheet. Later, when given an actual legal escape hatch, Skyler slams it shut herself. Her lawyer spells out the rational path. Leave Walt, protect the children, stop participating in his crimes. Instead, Skyler chooses to stay, to negotiate, to carve out terms under which the family keeps the secret and enjoys the money. She even turns on Hank and Marie after they take in the children for their safety, blackmailing them with the gambling money story she invented in order to keep the White family united around a lie. At one point, when Walt hints that he might turn himself in, she actively discourages him, reasoning that Hank does not yet have proof and that the safest course may be to wait this out. By then, she is fully complicit, not a captive. She has invested in the empire she once feared. Those who argue that Skyler always plays the victim are not entirely wrong. She often frames events as things happening to her, even when she has made key decisions that deepened the disaster. The series is unsparing in that regard. It allows her to be both frightened and calculating, trapped and yet responsible. So why does the hate still feel so profoundly disproportionate? Because most of the fury was baked in long before the TED checks or the car wash scams. Audience impressions were formed in the first 1 or 2 seasons, when Skyler is portrayed primarily as a suspicious, controlling spouse, blocking the protagonist's secret life. The iconic scene where she confronts Walt about marijuana, believing he is using it to cope with chemo, became a meme of cringe. The context, naturally, gets stripped away. In 2007, a middle-class woman with a brother-in-law in the DEA, living in a culture that still treated cannabis as a near-hard drug, would not react to clandestine pot use with a relaxed shrug. Add a precarious financial situation, a newborn on the way, a husband who is the sole earner, and the reaction looks far less hysterical than it is often described. Yet the lasting image is of Skyler as an uptight scold, wagging a finger at a man just trying to ease his suffering. First impressions win. Nuance loses. Gender finishes the job. The show offers a full roster of morally compromised characters: dealers, killers, liars, adulterers, thieves. Nearly every adult on screen could be fairly described as a terrible person in one way or another, with Walt Jr. standing almost alone as an exception. Yet out of this rogues gallery, Skyler routinely ranks near the top of most hated lists, surpassing even gleeful psychopaths like Tuco and hyper-competent villains like Gus. Viewers will cheerfully describe Walt as a badass and declare him their favorite character, while reserving a particular venom for the woman whose primary crime is refusing to clap for his transformation. It is difficult to interpret that pattern as anything other than discomfort with women who disrupt male wish fulfillment. Walt is a fantasy, the ordinary man who finally commands fear and respect. Skyler is the person at the kitchen table asking where the money came from and why there is blood on his shirt. She is the killjoy, the fun police, the mother on the sidelines reminding everyone that gravity exists. In a story built to seduce viewers into rooting for a monster, the person who insists on seeing the monster clearly will never be popular. There is also the small matter of what housewives are allowed to be on television. Skyler begins as the classic stay-at-home spouse, managing a special needs teenager, heavily pregnant, juggling bills, trying to keep the household functioning while her husband drifts through life in a fog of resentment. When that wife becomes angry, when she grows suspicious, when she withholds affection or demands answers, viewers do not read it as a rational reaction to betrayal. They read it as nagging. If she had simply accepted Walt's criminality with a shrug, her character would have been dismissed as thinly written, but at least she would not have interfered with the audience's vicarious thrill ride. Because she objects, loudly, messily, and not always gracefully, she exposes how limited the acceptable range of female behavior still is. A criminal genius can earn admiration for his ruthless ambition. A housewife earns hatred for refusing to smile while her life burns down. There is also a basic confusion between finding a character likable and treating that dislike as moral indictment. Many viewers quite reasonably say that Skyler would be exhausting company in real life. Sharp-tongued, intrusive, quick to judge, quick to issue instructions. Fair enough. The problem arises when that entirely ordinary aversion to a high-strung personality mutates into claims that she is somehow worse than the murderers and cartel bosses orbiting her. Not wanting to have coffee with someone is not the same as concluding that they are the moral low point of a fictional universe. In prestige television, abrasive men are labeled complex and showered with analysis. Abrasive women are told to stop talking and be grateful they have a husband at all. Skyler lives at the intersection of those double standards, punished both for being difficult and for daring to exist as an obstacle in a story whose central thrill is watching a man become monstrous. None of this absolves Skyler of her genuine flaws. She is often condescending. She is controlling. She pushes people, including Hank and Marie, into corners and then blames them when they bristle. Her pride is easily triggered and sometimes takes precedence over basic decency, as with Bogdan. She does make choices about Ted, about the car wash, about staying with Walt, and then wraps herself in a victim narrative that minimizes her agency. She even shares some of Walt's most unattractive traits: touchy pride, an instinct for manipulation, a willingness to rationalize wrongdoing when it serves the family. What separates the two is not a moral chasm, but a difference of scale and appetite. Walt pursues power and recognition. Skyler pursues survival and control. His sins resculpt the criminal landscape of an entire region. Hers ruin a handful of lives in the immediate blast radius. That distinction matters morally, but it does not erase the similarities that make her, in the end, far more than a one-dimensional martyr. If anything, the most damning critique of Skyler is not that she opposed Walt too much, but that she did not oppose him enough. When the lawyer first spells out the danger and tells her to leave with the children, Skyler hesitates because she has not yet fully grasped how selfish and dangerous her husband has become. When she finally does grasp it, she still chooses negotiation over escape. She agrees to the fiction of gambling winnings, participates in laundering, turns herself into the careful architect of their shared lie. She even walks fully clothed into the family pool at one point, a staged breakdown designed to force the children out of the house without openly exposing Walt. By the time she stands in the kitchen with a knife between Walt and the children, trying to hold back a man who has just destroyed everything left of their lives, it is far too late for clean heroism. At that point, she is not some pure counterweight to his evil. She is a collaborator who has belatedly realized that the monster she helped protect will never stop. The tragedy is that the audience is more eager to condemn her for picking up the knife than for all the quiet compromises that made the knife necessary. Certain scenes underline the absurdity of the hatred directed at her. After Ted's accident, for instance, Walt grandly tells Skyler that he forgives her, as though the man who has lied, killed, terrorized, and dismantled his family's life is in any moral position to absolve anyone of anything. Later, in one of the show's most devastating choices, Walt berates Skyler over the phone in language tailored to paint her as the hysterical, complicit wife, deliberately performing the monster so that law enforcement will see her as his victim rather than his partner. It is a twisted act of protection that does not erase what he has done, but it does underline what Skyler has endured. She has been the public face of respectability for a man who quietly became a warlord, and then the convenient lightning rod for all the projected disgust that viewers do not wish to aim at their beloved protagonist. What is striking, listening to people revisit the series in their mid-20s and 30s, is how often the story of Skyler's redemption involves no new scenes at all, only new eyes. The show has not changed. The acting, which was always excellent, has not improved with age. What has changed is the viewer, who now has some experience with bills, with illness, with partners who lie and retreat into themselves. Suddenly, Skyler's smoking in the driveway and crying alone in parking lots looks less like melodrama and more like an entirely recognizable form of despair. The annoying questions about second phones and strange absences look like the bare minimum one would expect from a competent adult in a collapsing marriage. The woman who once seemed determined to ruin the fun now looks like the only person consistently aware that there is nothing fun about any of this. There is a reason that variations on "Skyler wasn't actually that bad" keep resurfacing with each new wave of viewers. The initial backlash was so extreme that later audiences feel compelled to issue public statements of correction, as though petitioning to overturn an old, unjust verdict. At this point, the pattern has become almost comedic. The same shocked realization, the same inventory of Walt's atrocities, the same grudging concession that perhaps the woman whose life he destroyed is not the true villain of the story. The repetition, however tedious, serves as an informal survey of cultural attitudes. Younger audiences, steeped in anti-hero worship, tend to side with Walt, until time and experience sand down their sympathy. Older, first-time viewers, coming to the show with less appetite for macho fantasy, often never dislike Skyler at all. The material has not shifted, the moral compass of the audience has. In the end, Breaking Bad is a story about ego disguised as a story about money and sickness. Walt finally admits as much when he tells Skyler that he did it for himself, because he liked it and because he was good at it. Skyler's arc sits in direct conversation with that confession. She spends much of the series insisting that everything she does is for the family. The laundering, the lies, the awful choices about Hank's medical bills. Yet buried underneath is her own pride, her refusal to be the powerless, uninformed wife, her determination to steer events instead of simply surviving them. The audience is remarkably forgiving of Walt's ego because it is grand and operatic, the stuff of anti-hero legend. Skyler's ego is domestic and unglamorous. It manifests as passive-aggressive silences, as overbearing schemes, as a furious insistence on having a say. That makes it easier to ridicule and harder to romanticize. But it is the same force, playing out on a smaller stage. The real indictment, then, does not fall on Skyler White so much as on the collective response to her. A fandom that calmly accepts a protagonist who poisons a child, engineers multiple murders, and leaves a trail of corpses across the desert, yet still calls his wife the worst character because she is sometimes whiny and often right, is telling on itself. It is revealing which sins it finds unforgivable and which ones it will cheerfully excuse in the name of entertainment. It is demonstrating, with admirable clarity, that standing between a man and his power fantasy is far more offensive than anything that man might do to achieve it. Skyler is not a saint. She is not meant to be. She is simply the only person in the story who consistently behaves as though human lives, including her own and her children's, are not acceptable collateral damage for one man's wounded pride. That this has been interpreted as villainy says far more about the audience than about her. Subscribe for more breakdown like this.